Good afternoon, my friends. Today it's been a nice sunny day, and I'm pretty happy about that. It's sort of been a little bit of a manifestation. I don't want to take all the credit, but since I put out my Sun video, the Sun music video, which you can check on my channel if you're interested in, we've just gotten like a few days of just pure sunshine since Wednesday. So I think that was like a few days after I released the video. And it's been a bit cold, not too cold though, which is also very nice. Usually when it's sunny, it's like super frigid cold, but lately it has been colder, but it's not as severe as it could normally be, which is usually like minus 20 and so forth. So today I'm going to be talking a little bit about a subject that's on everybody's mind, whether you're paying attention to the news or not, or you've just been involved in current events, is the situation in China. And I'm not talking about the coronavirus, although that could be implemented as well in this talk here. But I want to talk about China specifically because I think it's going through, as a nation, as a culture, it's going through a huge shift at the moment. I think it's with whatever is going on in the world right now, whether physically in the real world and also spiritually on an energetic level, China's been going through a huge shift. And what I can see from that, especially in the Western world, is that a lot of people are underestimating China and Chinese culture in general and not seeing the potential that it has to essentially become a huge driving force in the world. And this is reflected mainly in the stock market. The stock market is an indication of what's going on in the world, what's going on in the economy, etc. And there's a lot of talk about people saying that, like, oh, China's due for a recession, China's due for a depression, they're about to hit a wake-up call. A lot of people, when they're in the financial world, they're talking about a what-if situation, thinking about the future. And the reality is China's already going through the recession. They've been going through it for several years now. It's just not something the Chinese government wants anyone to know. And when I mean a recession, I mean purely on a surface level basis. There's a lot of changes happening in the government, a lot of changes happening in corporations, and most importantly, a lot of changes happening with the labor market. The people who are working in these factories in China are changing their values, their desires to expand and go forward are also changing as well. So they want more money, basically, and it's becoming less and less affordable to actually do business in China, to actually buy labor in China. And as you notice, especially in clothing, you're finding less and less things made in China. They're most likely going to be made in Vietnam, Cambodia, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, these other, southern Asian countries that aren't in China. So a lot of people are thinking that China is losing their power, they're losing their force in these markets because people are going elsewhere to buy labor, essentially. What people don't realize is just because these factories are in other countries, China in general still has a hold on these factories. If you go to these factories in Cambodia, you'll find that most of these factories are actually owned by Chinese people. They're owned by Chinese businesses who recognize China is changing and it's going through another shift, and they're wanting to relocate and open up factories in other countries. And because these other countries are heavily involved with China, the language barrier between Chinese and whatever country they're going to, whether that's Cambodia, Thailand, Sri Lanka, Vietnam, a lot of them already know Chinese in general. There is a link connecting to those countries, basically just because they are Asian in general. So there is that link that exists. But there's also an important aspect to think about. that China's government is also changing as well. It's becoming a lot more strict. It's becoming a lot more regulated as Xi Jinping is sort of trying to take hold and take control of his power over the nation. And this is creating a tuft with the people that are living there, because the issue is that they've already tasted freedom. The difference would be if China as a country, as a nation, has already been under extreme oppression throughout the communist regime and before throughout the British control of it through the use of opium. And then when the communists came, they thought they would be freed, and it turned out it was actually the complete opposite. They just went even further down into oppression and basically slavery. Then once those limits were lifted and people were given the freedom to pursue their economic desires, to pursue business, China basically exploded into this huge economic force. And now you have the Chinese government trying to push back. And there's this sentiment that people think that this is just going to happen and that people are going to accept this because they've already been there. And this is the thing where I disagree with that notion. For one, is they already have a taste for freedom. They already have a taste of economic growth, of wealth, of prosperity. And they are going to want to defend that as much as possible now that they already know what they could possibly have. Because before this, they didn't really know what prosperity was. Don't forget that before the 80s, before China became this huge economic force, it was a very regressed country. It was a regressed nation. It was very oppressed. It was very, the progress wasn't there as a country. Now that they've seen that, they've lived through that, they're going to want that as much as possible. And if there is a notion from the Chinese government that's going to try to repress that in any way, shape, or form through laws and regulations, people are going to notice and they're not going to be happy about it. And personally, from seeing this in Hong Kong, just from the simple fact that they want Hong Kong to become part of China and how much these people are fighting against that, like millions of people fighting against this. If the Chinese government starts to do that in their own country and starts to actually take a grip on the people, things are going to change drastically. And it's already on paper, there's a lot of laws and regulations set up, just that they aren't enforced at the moment, because a lot of people in China, on paper, from a Westerner's perspective, they think it's sort of like a 1984 situation. Everyone's being monitored, and in a way it's true, but it's all very much, it's all an observational technique, right? It's all being put into place so that way when they want to attain control over the people, they'll just tighten the grips and just enact the laws, and then everyone will be oppressed, right? So these laws are being put in place, these restrictions, but they're not exactly being enforced yet at the moment. So Chinese people are kind of they're not oblivious. They definitely know what's going on, but there's no real enforcement of this severe contraction in the country. So right now, there's not much being done about it. There's not many people sort of rebelling against that and wanting something new. They're sort of avoiding that as much as they can. And with this coronavirus that's happening, there is this notion of fear that's going on, and it's sort of weakening the Chinese economy even more. But I think this is going to be a blessing in disguise, because it's only going to make people underestimate them even further as a nation, underestimate them further as being not with it and not the powerhouse that they once were. I think once we see in the future, as the coming months, is that there's going to be this huge shift in power that China's going to uphold. And it's not going to come from the government. It's not going to come from the Chinese government controlling everything. It's going to come from China as a nation, as a culture. Because right now it's sort of the underdog in terms of being respected. it's not a country that people regard as being oppressed in any way, shape, or form. It's not a country that's considered to be the ruling race of people, or whatever you want to call it in that way. They're kind of in the background a lot of the times, and this is very generally speaking. I don't want to generalize Chinese people into one group of people. If you're Chinese or whatever, that this is how you're supposed to be or whatnot. I'm talking from a very general perspective, because what they're going through is a lot like how America was during the 1930s, when they were in a Great Depression and everyone underestimated America as being, oh, I guess it wasn't as great as everyone thought it was. The American dream doesn't exist. And during the Great Depression, this really put them down, in a sense that they were, sort of wounded. But the thing about America at that time was that there was a united effort, that because they were going through this hardship, and because they were sort of stigmatized as not being involved really, that and because the American dream, if you want to call it that, sort of failed, it sort of created this union of a nation, which is what's happening in China right now. And when you go to other countries around the world, there's division everywhere, whether in Canada, US, Britain, Europe. There's so much division in the world. China's the only country, regardless of if people disagree on political things or what have you, there is this unity of pride within China as a whole. And if you speak to a Chinese person, it's going to be very hard to find someone who's Chinese who actually is just doesn't give a shit about China. And the only people who are like that are people who are born in America, and they're just considered Americans to begin with. And even that is hard to find as well. You'll find a lot of Chinese-born Americans are trying to go back and reconnect with their roots and understanding their own culture. If you go to America and talk about Americans in general, you'll find a division of people who hate America, and they hate the way it is, and they don't like America at all. And there's a lot of people who are like that. And there's the people who are ridiculously proud of their country to the point of just plain ignorance. And there's a lot of ignorance in China as well. But the difference is, in China, there is this notion of pride and this notion of respect for their own culture. And we're noticing this in, if you want to look at the spiritual community, how there's a lot of Chinese energetic arts or energetic practices that are definitely not popular in the States or anywhere in the spiritual community. It's sort of been, it's not been shunned or anything. It's never been a central core part of it. And I'm talking about things like Qigong, Tai Chi, Kung Fu, I Ching for divination, Chinese astrology. These are things that are definitely not included, but in the Western world, we take a lot of things like Buddhism. Buddhism is Indian, by the way. It's not necessarily Chinese. That should be emphasized, even though China has incorporated it. Generally, what happens in spirituality, especially in the West, is that we look at things like yoga and, Western astrology, tarot reading, tarot cards, and so there's a lot of things under the surface about what the Chinese have done also for thousands of years that's kind of been, it's sort of put into its own little box, its own little category. It's not really being involved in Western ideals, which I always find interesting. And this also goes to philosophy. Western philosophy basically shuns Eastern or Chinese philosophy from ever being a part of it, and they'll come up with millions and millions of excuses as to why this is, because it's not rigorous enough, it doesn't fit into it culturally, it's not part of the academic process, which is a load of bullshit, honestly. Philosophy is philosophy. There's no right or wrong way to go into it, but these are very academic fields that I don't particularly care much about, but it's still an example of how much we are underestimating Chinese culture. Even if we are to appropriate Asian cultures in general, Chinese culture is generally not involved. It's mostly either Korean culture or Japanese culture that most people are appropriating. No, not many people give a shit about China or have any respect for it. It's just kind of there. It exists. And that's about it. If you're going to talk to someone who's appreciative of Asian culture, most of the time they're talking about Japan or Korea. And I'm just going to be upfront. A lot of the cultures and the processes that they're assimilating and they're enjoying from Japan or Korea came from China first. Not everything, but if we're going to talk about things, just general cultural things like Taoism, the way Eastern thought originated was from China. If you look at a perfect example in anime, for instance, like Dragon Ball Z, is all based off of Journey to the West, which is a Chinese fable. It's a Chinese story. It's a Chinese mythology. And not even... also, aside from that, everything involving, ki and energy and meditation and all these different concepts that exist in Dragon Ball all came from Chinese culture. But it was created by a Japanese guy. So people, see things like Dragon Ball and sort of lump it in with Japanese culture, but it's actually not that at all. I'm sort of going on a tangent here because I think that there is a lot of hidden underground stuff that's going on, particular to China. It's nothing like sinister or anything like that, although there is some sinister stuff, especially dealing with the government, which is problematic. But I think people are very much underestimating what's going on in China. And the way to look at this is the stock market. Look at companies like Alibaba, Weibo, Tencent. See how poorly they're doing in the stock market compared to American stocks. Don't forget, all these Chinese companies I just named are profitable. They're making money. They're beating earnings like pretty much every quarter. And if they don't make that mark just by a little bit, even if they make money and if they don't create over expectations, then it's like it just keeps going down and down because everyone is underestimating them. Everyone doesn't like China. Everyone hates China for some reason because they are afraid of that power that they do have, which is that unity of the culture, and their sheer size of population is, it's incredible, and people need to be prepared for this rising of power, because that's what's going to happen. It's happened to America in the 1930s when everyone thought that America was doomed, the American dream failed, everything's going downhill. Because if you look at China, the Chinese country in the 2000s was booming. It was huge. It was big. It's sort of the equivalent of America during the 1920s. That was huge and booming and it just expanding extremely. And then you get to the 2010s, except China didn't even go through a severe depression. They just went through, I would say a minor recession, sort of like a pullback. And this should indicate the power that they do have, because America was pulled all the way back, and then once we get into World War II and afterwards, they basically were huge. They were incredibly triumphant. They became the kings of the world at that point. They were already sort of like booming in the 20s and becoming this big nation, making its mark in the world, but it wasn't the ruler, you know what I mean? It wasn't in control of the world and control of the power. It only happened after everyone doubted them. Everyone sort of didn't really care about America, and everyone was sort of doubting its ability to grow as a nation, that it actually overachieved after World War II. And this is just a prediction that I'm having, that China is going to go through its same restructuring. But before we get there, there's going to be a lot of problems. I think China is going to go through something that's even worse than what's going on now. This coronavirus is sort of a snap into place, especially that it's happened on the Lunar New Year, with a new cycle altogether. It's the year of the rat. That's the new cycle. It's a 12-year cycle that, happens every 12 years, obviously. So, and this is happening right on then. So this is a new beginning that's sort of starting in darkness. It's starting in a negative space with this disease and this virus that's spreading, that's like just pounding their companies back down, and especially in the stock market. That's like the very physical way of looking at it, as a metaphor of what's happening there. And my prediction is that they're going to overcome this in a way where we don't really expect them to. And I don't think it's wise to be what's the word I'm looking for? To basically think less of them in any way, shape, or form. I don't think it's wise to think that way, because they are a very powerful culture, a group of people, a nation, so to speak. And this isn't to categorize people and to discriminate or anything like that, or to think that anything bad is going to happen or anything good is going to happen. There's going to be a lot of weird things that are going to happen in this next decade, and I think China is going to play a huge role in that, but people don't expect it from them. People are focusing on other things. They're focusing on Donald Trump and Russia and Brexit and all this other shit that is going to play an important part, but don't forget that Trump's going to be leaving office, and it's either next year or in 4 years. Once Brexit happens, it's like, okay, that's end of story. You're not going to be talking about it anymore because it already happened. So it's like, why even continue that discussion? Brexit happened, you move on. And with Russia, there's always going to be something with Russia, but it's like, it's not really, it's a relevant power, but it's not, it's not China. It doesn't have that growth. It doesn't have that spirit, that power that has behind it. And I'm talking about the people in those countries. I don't give a shit about the governments. Governments are irrelevant at this era, at this point in time. The governments are going to be changing drastically. That's just how I see it. It's been so chaotic, and that's pretty much what the norm is at this point. This is what we're going into the 20s with, is a lot of uncertainty with government, a lot of mistrusting of the government, a lot of misunderstandings of what's happening in the government. And what's going to really happen is, how strong are the people in those actual nations? It's the people that are going to be the ones controlling things in a certain way. And you can see that in China, as they're trying to take control of the people, especially in Hong Kong, and they're failing. And this is going to reflect back into their own country. At some point or another, it's going to happen, because the people living there, they already know so much about the Western world. They already know what's going on in the world. They already know what wealth is. They know what prosperity is. They know what freedom is. And they know it well, to the point where if their freedom is taken away, they would rather die than see that freedom lost. So don't underestimate them. And keep an eye on what's going on, especially in China, because things are going to change. And I'll talk a little bit about the coronavirus too. And I think people are starting to see the failure of the Chinese government, especially in China more so. I think in the West, we're not really getting the full idea. But if you were to be in China, you know that they fucked up. This whole thing about the 2-week incubation period where they're spreading symptoms before symptoms arrive, I think it's kind of bullshit. I think they made up that whole narrative of the 2-week thing because the coronavirus was here in December and they did nothing about it because they just wanted to keep things chill. They wanted to maintain harmony without dealing with actual problems. And the people of China were affected by that. And so people who are concerned, especially outside of China, about the coronavirus, I don't think this has nothing to do with you. This is a Chinese problem. This is a problem in China. It's going to affect people outside the world, but I think what this is an indication of China changing and China realizing it's a physical thing that's happening that the government fucked up and failed to control and failed to take responsibility for, that the people there are starting to realize, like, because this is a real thing. This isn't just some, like, annoying bureaucratic paperwork bullshit that they had to go through because it's like, oh, like I didn't move into my apartment properly, so I have to fill out some forms to the police, and this is kind of annoying and whatever. because that's basically what's changing, is that there's a lot more bureaucratic processes. But those are things that, as long as I have my freedom, as long as I have my health, as long as I'm a doctor and I have the freedom to actually help and cure people, those are things that these bureaucratic processes for small things, they can sort of overlook that and not really notice it. But this coronavirus that's coming in is actually sort of a blessing, because it's sort of giving people a real look at the failure of the Chinese government to actually help their own people, in favor of maintaining this sense of harmony that everything's fine, don't worry about it. Because what happened was, you had Chinese doctors who knew about the virus beforehand. They were alerting people, be careful, SARS is back. It's not SARS, obviously, but the symptoms were similar and people thought like, oh, this is what it is. And doctors were literally saying that. Then they get arrested because they're spreading information that's going to cause panic. And once more and more people figure that out, that the Chinese government is not helping them, it's going to shift the perception of the Chinese government. And it's going to cause a lot of problems within mainland China. And people are starting to realize that, because, like I said, for a while now, it's been happening since, I guess, like 2013 around, was that there's been this increase in terms of control. But this control was easily overlooked because it didn't actually affect people in a real way. I'm talking like inconveniences in the government that were happening that were kind of annoying, but people could overlook it. Things like cameras everywhere, no matter where you went, and everyone was like, okay, whatever, I don't really care, because I'm not really breaking the law. Or this social credit thing, which, yeah, it exists, but like no one's really enforcing it. It's not really a big deal. It only matters if you're in a government position that would need to be implemented. Now you have this coronavirus where it's like, my family could die from this, and the Chinese government is doing a horrible job at protecting us, at making sure that these diseases are contained and dealt with properly. And people are starting to realize that, because now it's like, now reality is starting to hit as to what the Chinese government is doing. And people are going to start shifting, like what's happening in Hong Kong. And there is going to be this rebellious force that's going to happen. Like, I can just sort of see it happening now. And so this next decade, especially as it's happening right on the Lunar New Year, take that into consideration, that this is a new cycle. This is a new development of what's going to happen. Things are going to change. The old way of doing things since, 2008, which is when... actually, I'm going to look it up right now, because I'm not actually entirely sure. Just give me 1 second here. So Xi Jinping was in office, inaugurated in November 2012. He joined the Politburo Standing Committee. He was vice president. Okay, so this isn't... So the Lunar New Year 2008, Xi Jinping was vice president at 2008. So this whole past 12-year cycle in the Chinese astrological sense was all about Xi Jinping and his rise to power. But now that cycle has ended. And with the launch of this coronavirus, this is... It's sort of like a knife that just cuts through their power. And this is going to be evident in the next 12 years. So this isn't to say that in the next 12 years, I'm not really entirely sure if China is going to be the greatest power at the moment, or if it's going to be sort of in this deep depression, or it's going to expand. I'm not entirely sure what's going to happen. But I do know that after this 12-year cycle that's just begun, they're going to rise through this somehow. There's going to be this rise and progression, because right now this whole Chinese government thing with this power from Xi Jinping, it's starting to get cut down. It's starting to cut. It's starting to drill into it. It's starting to be transformed. And this is important to recognize. because China is going to play a huge role in the world. Already, I live in Montreal. There's so many Chinese businesses. So much real estate is being bought out by the Chinese. And I'm talking powerful Chinese people with a lot of money. And they're getting their money out of China. So this is already like under the table secret stuff that's going on in China, is that Chinese are moving their wealth. They're moving it out of China. And China is trying to hold on to it as hard as they can because they don't want these people to leave. And once that starts happening is when the people are going to start rising up, because they've already been through this bullshit before and they don't want to go through it again. They've tasted freedom. That's what they want. And they're willing to die for it. It could have been a vastly different scenario if we're talking about China beforehand was a very, free, relatively free country, and everyone was sort of happy and dandy and everything was fine up until this point. Then I would be scared for China, because then they would actually have power to control them. But since they've already been through this shit, they already know what oppression looks like, and they've already tasted the freedom. They're not going to just let this happen again. And they're already not. There's evidence to show that things are going to change. So that's all I really have to say on the topic. It was sort of on my mind lately, and hope you have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next time.